So hello everyone that's here and also here with us in the webinar audience. For those of you on the webinar, I'm a little bit of a floating voice right now. My name is Janie Liu and I work here at the Centre for Teaching, Learning and Technology at UBC as an educational consultant for Indigenous initiatives. And we're here with the UBC Learning Circle. Very grateful for that opportunity. I'll just take a moment to introduce the other members of our team as well, Amy Perot and Erin Yun, who we all work together here in Indigenous Initiatives. And we are very grateful to have the UBC Learning Circle here with us today. I was reflecting about that this morning when I saw some folks coming into the room. This is our fourth session together in our partnership, and we've been working together to offer these sessions that have a live audience as well as the webinar for a couple of years now. And it really felt great to see each other this morning, that familiarity, the smiles and the hugs, and to have the strength of this partnership. We are very grateful for it, so thank you very much. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the place where our learning is taking place, or where our live session is happening. We are here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, and we're very honored for that ongoing partnership and the daily reminders of the lands, and this place where our learning takes place is a place that has been a place of learning for many, many years, since time immemorial. So I want to acknowledge that connection and those relationships. Today is International Women's Day, March 8th. And this is a really special session for me. I'm thinking just very quickly, because we've got a great speaker here, I want to recognize Indigenous women specifically for a lot of the learning that I've been doing in many of the last few years for leadership, labor, and resurgence. And I also want to recognize the women who labored in our partnership to put the session on, and specifically Amy, Davina, Melanie here, who provided great leadership for that. Leah's in the room. There's lots of women in the room that I want to shout out and give some honor to. I got an email last week from Fernwood Publishing about the history of International Women's Day, and I want to just quickly read it. On March 8th, International Women's Day, women in more than 56 countries will walk out of their workplaces and classrooms and will withdraw their domestic and community labor. This withdrawal of both paid and unpaid labor brings attention to the oppression and exploitation that women experience in all aspects of life, from sexual and racialized violence to economic exploitation, reproductive injustice, and the unpaid care work that is the backbone of capitalist accumulation. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and also acknowledge solidarity for injustices, for Tina Fontaine, for many other missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, also for the women who grieve and hold families together in seeking justice. Thank you to the UBC Learning Circle for arranging this speaker. Our speaker today is going to be Harley Eagle, and I want to thank you, Harley, for coming to teach us about a topic that is very much honoring International Women's Day while taking up emotional labor to teach us about decolonization, structural oppression, and gender. Thank you, Harley. So please join me in welcoming Harley Eagle, and I'll pass this on to Melanie and Harley.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session, those on the webinar, and also those in the room here today. I'd like to first acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, whose land we are currently hosting the session from. Also acknowledge International Women's Day, thinking of all the aunties, the ta'as, the grandmas, the sisters, the daughters, and all the women that we have lost as well. And I'd also like to especially acknowledge Indigenous women today. I'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the Learning Circle, and And just to remind folks that have joined before and those in the room that some of our topics, they're topics of relevance to our communities, and they can sometimes be emotionally triggering or a bit sensitive. So we just invite people to look after themselves today. If they need to talk to a friend or an elder or a counselor and talk about what we've talked about today, please do that. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Melanie Rivers. I'm Lamawit. I'm from the Squamish Nation, and I'm the education coordinator for the UBC Learning Circle. Also like to let folks know, those that are in the room and those on the webinar, that we've got some team support here. Davina and Stefan are helping here with some of the technology and the sound. And also like to acknowledge the UBC Centre for teaching, learning, and technology for the partnership today. So I'll overview how the session will go, and then I'll introduce Harley a little further. Harley was here with us on our Learning Circle last week, talking about racism and structural oppression and critical consciousness. Continuing that conversation today. So we will, Harley has a PowerPoint presentation which he'll go through, and we'll have a discussion and question period at the end. So we'll ask questions in the room, and I'll repeat your questions so those on the webinar can hear. And then we'll also ask folks that have joined us from the webinar to pop their questions into the chat box. So we currently have about 35 people that have dialed in on the webinar, and we've got maybe about 15 or 20 so people in the room. So really thank folks for joining us today for this session. I find it really interesting to talk about male privilege on a day of International Women's Day, and from the perspective of an Indigenous man, I think it's such an important conversation for us to be having. So I'll introduce Harley a little further. Harley is Dakota and Ojibwe, and a member of Whitecap Dakota First Nations. He looks to Indigenous life ways to guide his work. His experience includes training and consultation in the fields of transforming conflict, anti-racism, dismantling oppression, cultural safety, and trauma healing. He is often asked to speak at conferences both nationally and internationally, and he holds a Master's of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management, and currently resides on Vancouver Island and works with Island Health. So welcome again, Harley. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you. All right, so I just want to thank you for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be here again today and to be in the room with all of these wonderful people, and to be joined by people online as well. I want to add my acknowledgements to the land and to the Musqueam people. I'd also like to acknowledge something that we don't often mention, but the femininity of the land as well. We often refer to the land as Mother Earth, and so it's lodged within that. But I certainly want to acknowledge that aspect of the land, and I'll talk a little more about that a little later. I also want to thank you for the invitation to be here today. I certainly recognize that I'm taking up space on a day when we should be focusing and truly and finding ways of listening to women, because we live in a system of sexism, and I certainly acknowledge my own sexism in this world, and that shuts down the voices of women. So thank you for this time that you've asked me to be a part of. And in saying that, I've also come to realize and know, as a male who's trying to figure out my own sexism as well as trying to address the systemic nature of it, I know that taking direction from women is highly important. So thank you to the women who invited me to be here today. I also want to acknowledge the influences that I've had in my life, and certainly there's historical influences around culture and that sort of thing, and many wise older people that have shaped my consciousness and my understanding of life at a bigger picture level, and that has often come from a cultural perspective, and so I want to acknowledge those people in my life. And specifically Indigenous women who I've tried to take direction from and walk alongside and to follow, really. And so many women of strength that have guided me and shaped my way of thinking and being in this world. And I still have so far to go. I'm still starting on this journey of trying to figure out my own sexism and trying to figure out how I walk in this world differently from the way that I've been influenced and socialized in this highly sexist world. And I also want to acknowledge there's amazing strength, but there's also been amazing vulnerability that has taught me so much, taught me about the deep need to be vulnerable in this journey. And I'm not talking about vulnerability as a weak or meek thing. I'm talking about the access to our hearts and to our spirits and our souls and the expression of that. And that to me is nothing but amazing strength. So I'm very thankful that I've been influenced in that way, and again, I have a long way to go. I also want to acknowledge the current, if you will, the present influences in my life. Those people that shape me and continue to shape me and challenge me daily. And I'm thinking about my partner, Sue, and I'm thinking about my children, Mars and Mahbia and Julie, who continue to shape me and to hold me accountable to how I claim that I walk in this world. Claiming how we walk in this world is one thing, but actually how do we show up in this world and walk in that way is a different thing, and it's those people that are closest to us that see the true self, true me, and they can certainly attest to just how far I have to go. And I'm just starting and mess up constantly, daily, and so I'm thankful for their voices and their strength that helped to shape me as a human being and as a partner, as a father, and as a brother, and all of those things. And I'm also thinking about the future generations. I have 2 grandsons and another grandchild on the way, and I know that we need to be taking that into consideration as we move forward in all of this. So the future people, as well as the future of this earth in which we walk on, we need to consider those aspects in how we walk in this world. And especially, I want to thank you again for inviting me here on International Women's Day. In some ways, it's a shame that we have to have International Women's Day, one day. Maybe there's a week or a month that we focus on this, but in this fast-paced world and in this world where we don't necessarily look and pay attention to our systems around us, it's both wonderful to have these kinds of moments, but also acknowledging that I wish we didn't have to have these kinds of moments. I wish we were walking in such a way that we were walking in balance with who we are and taking direction from women every single day and every moment in our lives. So again, we have a long, long way to go. It's actually quite an honor for me to be asked to be here. And again, I thank the women that asked me to be here. And I really like words, and you'll hear me talk about words in my presentations, and so I was looking into the word honor, and it talks about high respect and esteem, and that it's a sense of being privileged to being asked to doing these things. And it's interesting that the word privilege comes up in that word, because we're going to be talking about male privilege today. And it's also talking about to regard with great respect. And that's something that I'm striving to do in my journey of striving to respect women and femininity, and the femininity within myself that hasn't been nurtured as fully as it should have been. I'm learning how to respect those things. And again, I like the word respect because we're talking about respect is an interesting word because it's talking about looking again, re-looking, to focus on, to look back at, and to take into consideration, and to look completely and often back at a situation, and I think, or a person, and I think we need to do that in terms of the sexism that and the sexist world that we live in. We have to be constantly looking at that and figuring it out and acknowledging that it's there, and peeling back the layers of where we find it, because we certainly find it in every aspect of our lives and in every institution and every part of our journey. We have to begin to expose it even more than we are currently. And it's also talking about an excited level, it's acknowledging an elevated, excited feeling to someone or something by their actions or attributes, and that's something that I certainly find really important in my journey, is to pay attention to the way that women are in this world, because it provides me direction on how I need to be in this world. So again, it's an honor to be here. And then I just wanted to say this too, that in looking at the word respect, as it's connected to honor, there's also an aspect of respect as a sense of refraining from injury. And I thought that was really important to note, because we have to acknowledge the violence that surrounds sexism and the way that it operates in this world, the extreme violence, both the very overt and extreme violence that we see constantly in the news, but also the violence in the ways that we as men are socialized to believe as the norm, of just the way that we are. We don't often recognize the wake that goes around us of violent ways of being, our energy, or the way that we hold ourselves, the things that we think about. We have to acknowledge that as being violent and figuring out a way of changing that way of being. So again, it's an honor to be here on this special day. I also want to realize that there's challenges in the way that we are talking today. I much prefer dialogue, I much prefer circle, so that we can all have an opportunity to speak what's in our hearts and examine each other's words and thoughts and all of those kinds of things. So I recognize that that this way of presenting comes from a Western worldview. Comes from a hierarchical worldview, and there's a problem with that. So I want to acknowledge that and recognize that there's other Western influences that are occurring, especially in my own self. As I'm socialized as a male in this world, I often want to fix things, and I want to jump to solutions, and I want to ignore the feelings and the energy and the stories that need to be told. I want to jump quickly over that and go to solutions. So I want to acknowledge that those are also in my mind, and I will try my best to hold back from jumping to those solutions and ways of fixing things. And then lastly, time. We have an hour and a half with each other today in this format when, as we mentioned earlier, we need to be talking about this constantly. And so there's a challenge with putting this into an hour and a half session and trying to say as much as I feel I need to say in that time frame it's impossible to say everything that needs to be said. And then I also want to acknowledge that I'm thankful for the people in this room today, but I know that many folks out there at their workplaces and their workstations, I know there's all these demands, especially I find working in the medical world, where we're so spread thin. And I know that there's probably folks that are struggling right now out there to be multitasking. And that's really a challenge, and to say things at a really deep level and to know that they're being heard in that way. When we're pulled, there's probably phone calls going on, there's emails that are going across the computer screen. So I just want to acknowledge that I recognize that this format isn't the best way to engage in this much needed conversation around male privilege. And thank you for acknowledging the nature of this talk as being difficult. Certainly emotions and feelings and our history and triggering can happen, so thank you for noting that. And then lastly, as far as acknowledgements, I want to acknowledge the problem of talking about privilege, and I'll talk a little further about this, but oftentimes we talk about privilege, whether it's male privilege or white privilege, and if we only focus on that, that keeps it at the individual level, and we won't necessarily get to the systemic nature of all of this. So I want to acknowledge that, and I'll try my best to bring this constantly back to the systemic nature of what we're up against here. Certainly looking at my own individual understandings of the male privilege that I have is a starting point for all of this, and we have to address how it impacts us as individuals, but we should see it as a starting point, as one piece of a much larger picture that we need to address. So I just want to acknowledge also the objectives of today, and I'm just going to scroll through them quickly. They were basically outlined in the blurb about this event as well. So I won't necessarily delve into them because we will be talking about each of them. And I just want to make sure. And the last thing I will say about this particular slide, and you can see the things that we'll be talking about today, but I want to leave time for us to be able to have some questions and comments, and to hear your genius and brilliance and your experiences and your comments and your input into what needs to be talked about in this session. Sometimes we call this the question and answer portion, but I don't feel it should be that. It's a time for us to dialogue. So I'm looking forward to that portion of our time together. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about who I am in all of this. I wish we were in a different format. I wish we knew each other well so that you knew who I was, because in the knowing each other well comes trust, comes understanding, comes shared experiences, connections, and all of those things that are so important for this journey. We have to be human beings in this journey and find those connections and know each other in that intimate way that really helps to build trust for this journey, because trust is vital to the undoing and the working together to undo the systemic nature of sexism, and I need others to undo the privilege that I experience as a male in this life. I need to be hearing and listening very carefully to women, and I need to be connecting with those of us who are socialized as male in this society. We need to be working at this together as well. So for that we need trust. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about who I am. You heard a little bit about who I am in the introduction. I'm originally from Saskatchewan. My people, the Dakota people, are originally from Minnesota area of what's now known as the United States. My particular band was a part of the ethnic cleansing of the U.S. and Minnesota, where Minnesota there was an attempt to clear the Dakotas out of that part of the world. And that's our traditional territory, and we've been there for thousands and thousands of years. But in more recent years, my family, both on my father's side and my mother's side, who is Saulteaux and comes from the Saskatchewan area as well, that's who I feel connected with as far as who I am as an Indigenous person. And I want to say that I'm the child of survivors of Indian residential school and the reservation system and all of those terribly oppressive systems that sadly many of them are still with us to this day. And not only just the legacy of them, but the actual systems are still there to this day. I mean, we live, but we often talk about this in the work that I do around cultural safety, that we live in a country that is still an apartheid state. We still have the reservation system, and some folks call it the prisoner of war camps here in Canada, and we don't realize that. We've normalized it. We call them First Nations communities and that kind of thing, and we've normalized what they were originally set up to do, and they're still with us to this day. So I want to acknowledge that that's a part of my experience of walking in this world. And I also have experiences of being connected to that colonial experience, and that involves the experience of being involved in Christianity, certainly being involved in sexism and being socialized in that kind of way. And so those are my roots. I mean, I have to acknowledge those aspects, those negative aspects, and the real stuff that's happened to who I am, as well as the wonderful, profound things too, the connection to culture, the connection to land, the connection to ceremony, and those kinds of things are also a part of who I am. But it's really important in this kind of work to acknowledge those pieces that have shaped us, often negatively, as well, because if we want to undo them, then we have to know where that negativity has come from. And so in my journey, as I got older, and at one point I was going to follow in my father's footsteps and work in industry and resource extraction and that kind of thing, but I met a wonderful woman by the name of Sue, who was a feminist, and who was this profound woman who, when I met her and fell in love with her, it was love at first sight for me, not so for her. It took her a little while to realize that I was there. But she really held me accountable to how I had learned as a man to exist in this world, how I had learned how to be what she would call charming. And that was really about making sure that the patterns of sexism continued in my life, because it was comfortable. When you get socialized in a certain way, that becomes your norm, right? And so it's comfortable being a certain way. And she was the first one that helped me to see that those ways are actually damaging to relationships, especially relationship between man and woman, a couple that are considering coming together to be married and that kind of thing. And she really told me in no easy way of, if you want to be in a relationship with me, then you have to respect me. And so I had a choice at that point. And I chose to actually look inside and realize, yeah, there's some things about me that are really messed up, and I need to start figuring these out. And I'm still on that journey to this day. But she really got me involved in trying to understand my own experience as an Indigenous person. I had all of these experiences around, I knew that something was wrong. You know, when you walk in this world as a visibly Indigenous person, male in this world, there's certain things that you feel, right? And you have these experiences, but you have no way of understanding what that's all about. You don't learn about this stuff in school, like especially when I was in school. And we as Indigenous people, we didn't understand it. We know that there's something wrong, but we didn't have the understanding to put the pieces together to look at it in terms of the colonization or the racism or the sexism. We didn't have that kind of language, but it was my partner that helped me to get onto this journey of trying to figure that out. And so I began to look into it and develop language and understanding around the systemic nature of oppression in my own life. And then we eventually found ourselves as a young couple living and working on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Our two children were born there, and that's really important because it's connected to who I am as a Dakota person. We were living and working with the Oglala Lakota people, and they're part of the larger nationhood of the Oceti-Sakowin, the Dakota people. And so I started to learn about the continued treaty violations, the racism, the continued colonization, the impacts and all of those things, but certainly the continued efforts to control and to take away land from Indigenous people. As I started to learn about those kinds of things. So I started to get involved in Indigenous rights advocacy and that kind of thing, and really became an activist in a lot of ways. And that also led me to trying to understand the systemic nature of this, and so that got me involved in doing anti-racism work and trying to understand and to actually help others understand as well, understand oppression and the systemic nature of what we're up against. And then also during that time, I started to learn about conflict, and I started learning about Indigenous ways of dealing with conflict that are restorative. So I got involved in restorative justice, and with a focus on Indigenous ways, which for me was about using the circle process to bring people together who are in conflict to actually work together to make things right, and to figure out how to pay attention and to consider the person who's been harmed and how they can actually be healed, and what they need to make things right, what they need to hear from the person who harmed them, and what the larger community needs to embrace as far as what that conflict has done and its ripple effects. So the circle process helps to incorporate all of those kinds of understandings to deal with conflict. And the last thing I'll say about conflict resolution and practitioner and conflict in general, and I alluded to it earlier, that I believe that we live in an unresolved conflict situation here in Canada, in North America, and in other parts of the world where Indigenous people are still struggling against constant colonialism and historical colonialism. I believe that it's created it's a conflict, and it's never been resolved. So we live in this conflict situation that's so, it's become normal, it's normalized to not even see it. And I believe that we're still there. And I know that may sound hopeless, but I've learned through the circle process and engaging in other ways of thinking about conflict that I really feel if we apply conflict transformation strategies and thinking, that we can actually start to undo this conflict situation that we find ourselves in. I firmly believe that, and I'm seeing changes in systems already in my journey that are based on applying a way of dealing with these kinds of conflicts. And also there's the impacts on we as individuals as well. And certainly there's the collective nature of trauma. But certainly as I began to realize, as I facilitated circles, I used to be able to say when I first started to do circles, I used to be able to say, when somebody would speak about their experiences with being traumatized, whether it was childhood abuse or sexual abuse or extreme things like murder and things like that, I used to be able to say and look within myself to see how I've been traumatized as well, and say, oh yeah, I understand what they're saying because I have that experience as well. But I kind of left it there. But I began to realize as I began to look at my own behaviors and my own ways of being, I started to realize that they are connected to the traumas that I've experienced and that my parents have experienced and that my people have experienced, so historical and intergenerational and my own trauma, and how that's stunted my growth as a human being. And so I began to realize that I actually need to work at my own healing in all of this. So trauma-informed practice became and is something that's so important in my journey to understand that it's a part of all of this. All of this oppression has a really powerful aspect of unresolved trauma. And so by understanding trauma and its impact on us as individuals, and the collective, we can start to begin to strategize in ways that are actually creating healing spaces for us as well. So trauma-informed practice is a big part of who I am. And then lastly, I am now, in the last almost 4 years now, a cultural safety facilitator, and I want to say thank you for all of the Island Health, my Island Health colleagues that are watching via the webinar. And I find myself doing this work of cultural safety now for Vancouver Island Health. And I want to say that all of the aspects that I've listed there about who I am are a part of cultural safety. We have to understand the historical nature of what we're up against. And that history reaches back further than just the last 400 or 500 years. That's the way we talk about cultural safety. My colleague and I, Yvette Ringham-Cowan, when we do this work, we talk about the older story of colonization. We want to understand the impacts of trauma that are ancient, that have shaped our societies, and the way that we think civilization is constructed. We don't realize that the unresolved trauma that's a big part of all of that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So we have to understand the history of all of this and the current realities and the impacts on Indigenous people. And as many of you know that are involved in this work around health, that Indigenous people, as far as indicators go, we're always at the top of the list in almost every aspect of health indicators. So there's a huge problem. If we notice that and we start peeling back the layers, that'll help us understand how to create culturally safe settings for Indigenous people. And then we have to figure out how we move forward together in all of this as well. So that's who I am as far as my introduction. And so I want to talk a little bit now about the issues with only focusing on privilege, as I mentioned earlier. And I already said this, if we only focus on privilege at an individual level, then it will keep us from looking at the systemic nature of it. And in fact, if we only think of it as impacting myself as a male, then I'll be focusing on my own needs, and I won't look at the systemic nature of all of this. So, and in the work that we do around cultural safety, we look to a story a concept that has been introduced to us by a Nigerian author by the name of Chimamanda Adichie, and she does a TED Talk on the danger of a single story. So it's not I'm not saying that we don't need to focus on the impacts of male privilege on myself as an individual, but it's only a part of the story. And there's a danger when you only focus on one piece of the story, the single aspect of the story. We have to understand the story writ large. And that leads us then to recognizing and seeing how we're socialized as males in the society and how that's constructed within society. So the systemic nature of injustice becomes really important. And so if we only focus on male privilege, if we only focus at that level, then we'll miss a big part of the story that we have to be focusing on as well. And also, if we're only focusing on our own privilege as men, then we will disregard the lived experience of those that don't fit the hierarchy of patriarchy. If the focus remains only on ourselves and dealing with our own male privilege, we run the risk of pathologizing ourselves as men, of only blaming ourselves and dwelling in the guilt and shame that comes with recognizing male privilege, and then that denies us the ability and learning the skill of actually listening to the lived experiences of women and the genius and brilliance of women that can point to and shape and explain the systemic nature of all of this. So if we're only focusing on ourselves and working at that male privilege at an individual level, we'll miss all of those profound things that will actually benefit us in our journey. And then it doesn't address deeply ingrained superiority. We have to recognize as men that we're ingrained with this thinking that we feel that we are the ones that have the answers. I talked earlier about fixing things and solutions. We often think that we, as men, we know what to do. We're rational and logical thinkers, and we're taught as men often that emotions and feelings aren't important. and in fact they're a sign of weakness. And so we're the ones that actually have the clear mind to think how to solve and find solutions really quickly. So if we don't focus on the systemic nature of how we're socialized as men and the harm that comes from that and the denial of who we are as human beings, that emotional side of us, the feeling side of us, then we'll again miss the systemic nature and a systemic address of sexism. And also, there's also pieces around that, around superiority. It's also about the right to comfort, of feeling entitled to being the holders of power in making decisions, and the right to be comfortable. And we don't know what to do often when we're challenged as men, especially by women and other marginalized groups. We don't know what to do with it because we're not used to it. And we're so ingrained in us that we have the answers, and we've looked to, we have education around how to find the answers, and we know them. And so when we're challenged, it often throws us into quite a tizzy, because these feelings come up, but we don't know what to do with them. Or we do know what to do about them, but it's shaped by a socialized sexism pattern that's based in violence. That we want to shut down the voices. We want to be comfortable, and often we do that in a violent way. And so we have to notice these kinds of things at that systemic level in order to address our privilege in a holistic way. And there's also a piece of this too that I want to raise, because I've seen this happen time and time again, where when women stand up and point out that something is wrong or bring an issue forward, they're often painted as difficult, as troublemakers, because it's making us uncomfortable as men, as people who hold power, and it's a way of shutting down those voices and actually labeling women as crazy often, right? As being stressed out. You know, and we end up pathologizing women for actually standing up and saying something is wrong here, right? If we don't notice the systemic nature of all of this and how we've been socialized as men, that's where we go. And that's what I mean about our violent response to being challenged as men. And that comes from a systemic nature. This has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then lastly, and maybe I should also say this too, that if we only focus on an individual understanding of male privilege, then we'll do all sorts of things to make people think or feel like that we're one of the good ones, that we don't carry that, we don't have that, I don't operate that way. And so then you begin focusing on your intentions and not looking at the results of your behaviors and the way that you operate in this world. So that's really important for us men to recognize that we can't help ourselves because we've been socialized this way. And that's why the address needs to be both as an individual and systemically. We have to start changing the social fabric of how we are educated as men, how we're nurtured as men, or how we're not nurtured as men, as human beings, and what that's done to us, the damage that's done to us. And if we don't realize that, then we'll focus on trying to make sure that we are seen as not sexist. And there's an extreme danger in that. And then lastly, we won't look at the history of sexism, and that's we have to look at where has this come from? How has it been connected to where we are today? How has history and how has our experiences, how has our journey shaped this to where we are? And one of the things that I wanted to focus on today is looking at the Indigenous experience in all of this, and it's actually really helpful to look at that, because then we can start looking at the nature of say, the missionary, the Christian missionizing of Indigenous people, where there's an attempt to disrupt a worldview that wasn't sexist. right, that was matriarchal in most cases of Indigenous people. So if you start to look at that and study that, you can begin to see the history of how this actually happened, where this notion of patriarchy has come from. And so if we only focus on ourselves, then we won't look at that history. And that's often a really uncomfortable place to go. For the Christians that I've worked with for all of these years, that's a hard thing to look at, because I'm certain too in academia, looking at the history of sexism within academia is a really uncomfortable and difficult place to go, especially for we that are socialized as male in this society. And I call it, what we often end up doing is poking people in their identity, because we've incorporated those things into our identity. Right, and so it really hurts if somebody is troubling that for us, because that's who we are. And that's why I'm saying, so understanding the systemic nature of all of this is really important, so that we can understand where this has come from and how we think and how we walk in this world. So I want to just talk a little bit now about my journey to understanding my male privilege, peeling back the layers to expose patriarchy. And in this Western world, the focus is often on self and individualism. And as I mentioned before, that's definitely a piece of this. I have to look at my own behaviors, and I have to look at my own patterns, my own thinking, the way that I think, and start to disrupt that at an individual level. But I also have to look at that in terms of how I've been socialized, to recognize where that has come from. And oftentimes, what's really important here, I mentioned this earlier, is vulnerability. Because oftentimes when we look at things like internalized or privilege around race, white privilege and male privilege around sexism, it leaves us at a really guilt and shame-ridden place. Because for many of us, we don't want that. We don't want to be this way. But when you begin to realize and it's exposed and shown to you that you are operating in this kind of way, it produces this guilt and shame. And in the work that we do with cultural safety, with Island Health, we look to the work of Brené Brown to help us understand vulnerability. And we really like how she frames it in the story that she tells about the U.S. And she's from Texas, and she said a couple years ago that the biggest issue facing the U.S. right now is racism. And I would say that it's the same here in this part of the world, in Canada as well. And she says, and the problem is that we're not having deep dialogue around racism in order to talk about it at its systemic level and all of those kinds of things. And she says, from her understanding of vulnerability, the reason why is because in order to talk about racism, you have to talk about privilege. So in order to talk about sexism, we need to talk about privilege. But who wants to talk about privilege when it produces all of this guilt and shame? And so she says that shame is held in place by three things: by silence, by secrets, and by judgment. So those are the things that shut it down. So we don't tell the history of sexism. We don't tell the history of colonization, especially from an Indigenous perspective, and for sexism, especially from a womanist perspective. We don't hear those things. Those are difficult things to access. It's not common knowledge. So we'll keep that story silent. Or we'll keep those secrets. That's the truth, but we'll keep those things secret. And then silencing is that we won't provide spaces where we can actually hear from people in a different way, because folks often talk and speak in a different way and are comfortable in different ways of being. So I'm thinking about Indigenous settings, where we have a voice, but in settings like this, and oftentimes in mainstream academia, it's difficult for Indigenous people to engage in this way. And certainly we're learning this kind of way, and we can engage in this. We can be both and in this. And, we're learning that aspect, and it's been powerful. So that's one piece of silencing. But another piece of silencing is around the judgment that we have in our heads, and how we quickly go to explaining away when people expose to us or talk to us about a different understanding. We'll quickly jump to narratives that are in our heads that will explain away Oh, they're just an angry woman. Oh, they're just an angry Indigenous person, so I don't have to listen to them. It's things like that where we silence the voices that could really be helping us to understand what we're up against in a wholesome way. So she says that shame is held in place by guilt or by secret silence and judgment. But she says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. So if we can provide settings where we can actually access our stories, our true stories, and have places where we can hear them and talk about them, then we can actually address the shame and guilt. And my understanding of all of that, there's a story that I like to tell, and my partner Sue, after many years of wanting me to be vulnerable with her. And I thought I was, but really I wasn't, because she kept on saying, Harley, you need to be vulnerable, right? But I couldn't hear that. I couldn't understand it. Now, reflecting back, I can hear and see some of the places where she's been saying for many years, and continues to say, Harley, you need to be vulnerable with me in our relationship. But the first time that I felt that I was truly vulnerable with her was when I shared with her something that I thought I would never ever share with her, or with anybody for that matter. I thought I would keep it a secret in my own way of dealing, and deal with it in a different way that didn't need for me to tell the story to her. But finally I did, after, again, many years of prompting. And I still remember the moment, and there were lots of tears, and I was telling her this story. But I also remember this moment. After I said it, I said to her, there's a lie in this world for us men, because we're told that sharing our feelings and our emotions and being vulnerable is a sign of weakness. And I said, in this moment, I do not feel weak. I feel strong. I feel there's something powerful in all of this. And that's what I really like about Brené Brown's work, is that she talks about vulnerability as the gateway to innovation and creativity. It's strength. There's strength in all of that. And so, and that's denied to us as men in this society, that we're socialized to believe that it's actually a sign of weakness, and that we shouldn't be vulnerable. So, I think I already spoke to...
Harley?
Yes.
Sorry. You were telling the story about racism that Brené Brown said. Could you go back to that for a sec?
Sure. So she says that the reason why we're not talking about racism in a full way, in the way that we need to be, this deep dialogue around it, is because of shame. We shut it down because it's uncomfortable. And I certainly recognize that as a male in this society, and the privilege that I carry. At some level, certainly many years ago, I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to be seen as one of the good ones, right? But I'm learning that as I talk about it, and as I connect with others that are also on this journey, there's so much strength in all that. And we're getting to these creative and innovative ways. It actually helps you to strategize on how to deal with patterns of oppression and sexism. It helps me to understand, okay, so how do I, as a male, use my privilege in helpful ways that expose the systemic nature, or call into accountability other men who are being hurtful and being violent in their ways of being. Maybe with not even realizing it. Sometimes that's what happens. We don't even realize it as men. We don't realize that energy around us that goes before us and around us, and how harmful that is, and how it shuts people down. And if we don't realize that, then we won't address it, and we won't change the way that we're being, so that we can get to this place that people can share their stories, and that we can learn from the stories, and then strategize together on what we can do for change. So that's the connection to Brené Brown's story around racism. So I think I'm speaking to many of these things that I have up on the slide here, and understanding trauma and its impacts personal experiences, intergenerational, historical. Again, trauma becomes really important in all of this, because many times we have to begin to realize our experiences as men in this society, and I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't want us to take on a victim's perception of who we are. But there's been a lot of harm that's been done to us as men in this society, of how we're socialized. We're not fully nurtured. And that might sound kind of light, just saying we're not fully nurtured, but I'm really talking about brain development. Right? If we're not nurtured in profoundly loving situations, then we're not going to be fully developed as individuals, and that's developmental trauma, really. And a lot of our ways of being in society hold us back, and certainly not just men, but in particular what we're talking about today, we as men end up being stunted because we're not accessing who we should be as human beings. That way of walking in this world that incorporates that natural aspect of who we are at an emotional level. That gets shut down, and it's so harmful for us. And it's really important to understand that as a male, but also not to get stuck there and take on a victimhood way of being. And that's why, again, the connection to the history of this, where did this come from, becomes really important. Because then you start to realize, okay, if that's the patterns of the society and that's what it's done to me, then I need to change those patterns. I need to be involved with others who are changing those patterns. And that's where systemic change becomes really important for our journey. And in those moments of undoing those patterns, you begin to grow. You begin to find that nurturing. You begin to find that in the authentic relationships that you begin to develop. And I want to say this too, that I talk about these things, and it's really important for me to say, I don't say these things to denigrate we as those of us who are socialized and visibly male in this world. I don't say this to denigrate us, because my experience in this, and as I strive to undo my own sexism, is that it helps me to grow as a human being. And when I do that, the relationships that I have with women and my own femininity is authentic. And that's what helps to nurture you as a human being. And we can actually, our brains are pretty profound things. There's neuroplasticity. It can grow. It can learn these things. Even at a later stage in our life, we can learn this and unlearn things and do things differently. It takes time, and it takes repetition, it takes practice, but we need to go to that place. So I want to keep moving here. I'm just noticing the time. Intersectionality, the importance of the collective. So I'm already speaking to these things. It's really important to understand the systemic nature, the institutional racism and sexism that surround us. And what I have learned that the collective actually shapes the individual as well. So if we can notice the patterns in society and notice those people that are striving to do something about it and start to connect with them and start to work from an analysis of a systemic analysis of all of this, it actually helps us to find others, and it creates the situation where we're not just working at this at an individual level, which is really important, but we're working at this together, and we end up starting to address many of the oppressions that are around us, whether it's sexism or racism or ageism or issues around sexuality. We begin to notice these patterns, right? Because the patterns are often the same around secrets, silence, and judgment. It's holding us back from taking this holistic look at what we're up against. So, and I just wanted to touch on too of why for us in doing this work at a cultural safety level, we often talk about Indigenous specific racism, and it's really important here, and I'm going to lead us somewhere that I think is really vital in all of this journey, and maybe something that we're not talking about as fully as we should be. Indigenous specific racism is really important for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that we talk about is the connection to land. And not just a connection or a relationship, but a whole way of being with the land. Land is relative. Land is a part of who you are. It's a part of your identity. It's a part of your, every aspect of your life was shaped by the land for Indigenous people. We lived that way for thousands and thousands of years, right? And it's only been in the last 400 or 500 years that's been changed. So it's really important to look at Indigenous specific racism because it takes us back to that connection to the land and the importance of land in everybody's life. I mean, we live in this world now where we see what so-called Western progress and civilization has done to our environment and to our land and to our oceans, to our animals. It's not working. Right? And I believe in Indigenous specific racism helps us to understand that that's a huge piece of all of this, that disconnect from land as relative. So that's why it's really important. It's one of the reasons why it's really important. And that history of colonization, of how it's connected to colonization, the process of disconnecting us from the land. If we look at that history, you can see that process. And I want to share one thing about that, and that we talk about this in our cultural safety work, and that's the connection to something called the doctrine of discovery. Can I ask in the room, how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? There's a good number of hands. It's not very often that happens. It's often in the settings that we find ourselves doing this work that there's no hands that go up that understand what the doctrine of discovery is. So really quickly, the doctrine of discovery is basically the legal and moral apparatus that has allowed for modern day colonization, so the last over 500 years of colonization. And not just colonization of Turtle Island in North America, but all over the world, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, all of the places that we can call colonial in their setting. And so the Doctrine of Discovery was a series of papal bulls issued by the Catholic Church, because they were one of the main powers of the day back then, to figure out a way of dealing with the problem of, as these explorers went out looking for new resources and looking for land to claim for the monarchs who they were representing, the problem of finding people there. So one of the first papal bulls said something like, if you find that there's people there, but you don't recognize their form of government and they're not Christians, then they're not fully human. And so that takes away that problem that you had, that moral dilemma of what about the people? How can we take the land when there's all these people there? So that eliminates that. And there's a whole series of papal bulls that were issued, and another one is about divvying up the land. So there's a reason why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, and why Spanish a little further north and French a little further north. It's because the Doctrine of Discovery divvied up the land with the monarchs, the European monarchs, in the claiming of at a global level the so-called new worlds that were being discovered. So what I find is really important in all of this is that the Doctrine of Discovery is still with us to this day. It's still being used by Supreme Court systems, justice systems. It becomes precedence. It becomes international law. And international law is just this vague kind of law. Some people call it a soft law, and some scholars say it's not really a law. It's simply the way that nations interact. That becomes law, so it's precedence. So court systems to this day continue to look to it and say, well, this is the Doctrine of Discovery had these nations interacting this way, so we'll decide in favor of them because this is precedence. So it's really important to recognize, and we tell this story because we don't want people to think that, or we often hear that it's just human nature. Just the way that we do things, the way that we're oppressive to others. It's just human nature. And I would like to think that it's not. It's about the systemic nature. It's the pieces that are in place that we don't even realize, we don't even see anymore, that keep things going a certain way. And that's really the nature of racism and other isms. It's not, actually, for me, racism and sexism and other isms, it isn't designed to hurt the people that get hurt because of it. It's the result of keeping things doing things a certain way, just believing that that's the way it's supposed to be. And there's all these systems in place that go unnoticed. But what happens is, the result is that it hurts and harms and kills and produces, harm in genocidal and gendercidal proportions of a group of people, simply to keep things a certain way, to keep certain aspects of that system benefiting in a certain way. So what's really important to think about in terms of the doctrine of discovery is that there's always a Latin byline that goes with the doctrine of discovery, and it's terra nullius, empty land. And so that, that concept that there was nobody on the land, so you can claim it. But I think there's something more insidious there. And it goes along with understanding that colonization isn't just about subjugating the people and taking the resource. It's also about changing the worldview of the Indigenous people so that they begin to participate in your system. And so that's what I think that terra nullius is so insidious, and it's something that we don't talk about as much as I think we should, because I think therein lies, you can see where it's the beginning of, in terms of that time frame, of how the worldview changed from recognizing that Earth was a part of who you are, it's a relation, it's kin, and you walked with the Earth because it was mother. Right? And it was a part of who you are. That worldview was central to your whole way of being and your culture. But that gets changed with terra nullius, because not only is it empty land of people, it's devoid of life. It's a material thing, something that you can use and abuse for your own benefit, for your own interests. And because for Indigenous people, land was, for many of Indigenous people, land was connected to femininity and to women, then it follows through that the next step then, if you take that away, the next step is then that women become something that's material and that can be used and abused. It's a changing of the worldview of Indigenous people who considered women to be, even in my culture, Dakota culture, women were considered actually even higher than men, and not really in a hierarchy kind of way, but there was more to women in our cultural teachings. And so it was really important for men to value, to hold in high esteem, to respect and to honor women in our ways. And a lot of our ceremonies for men were about remembering that aspect of the importance of femininity, of women, of the land, and even of ourselves. So that gets changed when there's something like the doctrine of discovery that sweeps the land and has this notion of terra nullius, empty land, devoid of life. So I think it's really important to look to that and begin to see how these things get broken, how our relationships get broken, how we get disconnected from land as relative, from women as leaders of our communities, women as the people that we need to look to provide direction for how we walk in this world. And that then goes to what I was talking about earlier, a premise. It's one of the foundations, one of the pieces, the doctrine of discovery of sexism. And the violent nature of that, of using, abusing in extremely violent ways. Now, I'm not saying that that's the start of sexism. I'm saying that that's a piece of it for our context here as Indigenous people, my perspective as an Indigenous person of this land, of Turtle Island, because it was alive and well before. I mean, if you look at the history of Europe, and its history of colonization and its breaking of who the Indigenous people of Europe were when they were colonized by the Holy Roman Empire, and the breaking of the understanding of women as leaders in the community, women as the wisdom keepers. You can look at the history of that and see, aspects of gendercide in Europe, of the changing of that nature of the Indigenous people there to one of patriarchy that still exists to this day. So it's really important to look at the history of all of this and understand those impacts and how it shaped our systems in this day and age. So I want to ask, I think I'm going to stop here just for a second because it's kind of ironic. My next slide is about moving forward and fixing things. No, it's not really about fixing things, it's just what I have found helpful in my own journey. So I want to just stop there and take one or two questions or thoughts or comments in all of this.
If there's any thoughts or comments from the webinar folks, you can pop those in the chat box and I'll relay them to Harley.
Thank you, Harley, for the knowledge that you've shared this morning. Kind of a practical question that we get in workshops, or this particular one comes from a classroom experience, where you're doing a class or a module on social justice and talking about various privileges, and the male student in the class puts up his hand and he's excited and kind of nodding and understanding, but saying, I think you might have been in this class when the student was like, okay, so I know I have all this male privilege, now what do I do with it? And so how do you, in those moments, with the limitations of time and space and where you are, what do you say to students where they're shifting from an awareness kind of moment to an understanding moment, and do you have any advice?
So there's actually, I think, a couple things that could be done. One is to encourage the male who's saying this to sit with that feeling, to actually go to the emotional level, the vulnerability level, practice vulnerability for a while. Find settings where you can go and share and talk and hear from others, connect with other men who are on this journey as well. Because that's our tendency as men, is to jump to, so what can I do about this? How do I fix this? And it's not just men. We've noticed this too in trying to address racism as well. We want to jump to structures, and part of it is because of the uncomfortableness of it all. We don't want to feel uncomfortable anymore. It's a hard place to be. But realizing that delving into that aspect of it becomes a tremendous source of strength, of knowledge, of it's the beauty and strength of vulnerability, really. And so encouraging male students, male colleagues to go to that place becomes really important. Second piece to all of that is strategizing, because sometimes it takes another man to say that, another man who's on that journey. Because of all of the patterns of sexism in our lives, we hear things differently. And actually my partner, Sue, is in our work around racism, she's helped me to understand that. Like I might say something a certain way as an Indigenous person, and she'll say, they didn't understand you as white people because you weren't speaking white to them, right? There's a certain way and a certain way of speaking about things that perhaps I don't carry in terms of addressing racism that she can as a white person. And it's the same for us as in male privilege and sexism, that it takes a man who's on that journey to be able to speak to a person who wants to be on that journey and wants to do something about it, to encourage them, to internally motivate them to go to that place. Because oftentimes our need to address something is something external. But really it's about looking first within ourselves. And actually this slide, I went too quickly there. Can I go back? Yeah. That says, as best I can, try to build authentic relationship. It starts with me. So building that authentic relationship with ourselves, to notice what has not been nurtured within ourselves as men first, I think is the best step. So thank you for that question.
We've got a question in the webinar. So wondering if an approach related to the discovery of new land and new resources, if a conversation went such as this, hey, we're from a different country, we're running out of resources and land because our population is growing, would you mind sharing your land and resources with us?
Yeah. Boy, that's I wish it would have happened that way. And I've thought about that a lot. In fact, at one point I asked, I won't name the person that I asked, but in terms of my own experience as an Indigenous person on this land, trying to walk in this way, in spite of the colonization and all of the harm that it's done, when you look at that history, it's such a it's such a terrible thing to view and horrible to view, and to realize the impacts that are still with us to this day. It's a really hard place to look. In spite of that, I still feel really lucky that I still know a little bit of my culture, my language. I know where I'm from, where my people have been for thousands and thousands of years. So I asked a white person one time, what do you do with that? Because for a lot of folks of European descent, there's a disconnect from that history, right? And so I was talking with this person who had talked about that disconnect from their history. And so it took this person a while to be able to answer the question. But when they did, they said, so I thought about your question, and this is how I think about it now. That in order to walk in this world without that connection to history and place and culture and all of that, I have to walk as a guest on this land. That's what I'll strive to do as a white person, to be a guest on this land. So then that took a whole different meaning for me as a Dakota person, because we had a ceremony and a process for the making of a relative. It's called the Hunka ceremony, Hunka process. And I thought to myself, boy, wouldn't that have been wonderful if that's what had happened all those years ago, that we were actually making relatives with the newcomers to our land. Because then with making of relatives, there comes responsibility, and there comes accountability, that you have to help this person know how to walk on the land in the way that you saw walking on the land. So wouldn't have that been totally a wonderful place to be? It's a nice notion. But I think before we go to that place, I think we have to look at the history and ask the question, so what happened to European people that didn't allow for that? What happened to them? And so then if you look at that history of Europe, then you can see where the disconnect has happened and why there was the development of this survivalist way of being that's normalized, right? So at one time there was indigenous people in Europe, and they were colonized. And that, same as the process here, it changed the worldview of indigenous people there to being one of what we see to this day. And so that's why it's so important to look at trauma and to understand how a person, how a community, how a collective walks with unresolved trauma, how a family walks with unresolved trauma. And really you become a person, you become a family, you become a community that's about surviving. That's about making sure that trauma never happens again. That's what happens to a person that's living with unresolved trauma. Your life becomes about making sure that trauma never happens again. Putting yourself in places where you might be triggered. You guard against that, right? Because you don't want to be triggered, because you've learned that when you're triggered, all of those chemicals and all of the hormones and everything that you experienced when you first experienced that trauma are coursing through your system again. It's painful, it's hurtful, you don't want to go there. So you become about protecting yourself, right, from that. So what happens if there's a person, a family, a community that were starved because of colonization? So their lives are going to become about making sure that they never starve again. So they'll start to hoard. And they'll change their way of being from walking on the land where you knew that the land would provide for you, to one of changing the way of being so that you can have storehouses full of food and whatever it is to make sure that you never starve again. But if you don't connect that to the story of the traumatic experience, and you start to not pass that story along, but you just keep on hoarding, and you do that generation after generation, and you forget the stories of why you're doing it, and it becomes just normal, pretty soon that normal turns into a sign of success as well. The ones that have the most are the ones that are the most successful. And pretty soon that becomes your worldview, right? As your collective, as your community, and as your people start to operate in this way, that becomes a norm. And I really believe that was the advent of a capitalist way of being in this world, where you needed more and more resources, where you used up resources because so many people were were collecting this, and monarchies, people at the top of this hierarchy were collecting so much and hoarding so much that you needed new places to find more resources. You weren't able to think in a way that's about 7 generations, right, of making sure that you only took enough for what you need now so that it could regenerate and you could go back and take more and use more, and that you have this mutual way of being with the land that gets changed to one of trying to get as much as you can so that you never starve again. So it's important to recognize that and not just dwell on what could have been, right? Because there's a reason why it didn't happen, and we have to realize that that's impacted our way of being.
So we've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So we do have some other questions, but do you want to finish your slides? Or?
Yeah, let me finish these because this is how I found, and I want to read something. These points come from the work of some friends from many years ago, Leonardo Pizzana and Karen Pace, and they're out of the Michigan State University Extension. And they talked about a commitment to the ongoing process of developing an authentic relationship across racial and gender differences. And this has helped them to identify important foundational qualities of relationship. These characteristics are essential to building trusting and lasting relationships across race and gender within a society that continues to be grounded in racism and sexism and other forms of oppression. It has also been important for us to recognize that although much of our work in developing an authentic relationship has occurred on the personal and interpersonal levels, our relationship is also deeply impacted by institutional and cultural systems that have influenced our behaviors and defined our privileges or lack thereof. The following characteristics have been important to us in creating and nurturing an authentic relationship across race and gender. So they came up with a list of about 20, I believe it was, and I've listed 6 here, the ones that have been really important to me in my journey. And I'll just talk about them really quickly. A willingness and eagerness to be challenged, recognizing that being comfortable is a part of that privilege, that entitlement to be comfortable as a male in the society, and recognizing that it's a place of discomfort that actually will help you grow as a human being. So you have to be willing and eager to be challenged. And then a willingness to not be in a place of denial and resistance. So again, recognizing and knowing the history of where this comes from. What I often say in talking about my own sexism, I say, how could I not be when I look at the systems around us and realize how sexist and racist and all of those things they are? How could I not be that? Because I've been surrounded by it all my life, right? So I have to be not in that place of denial, that it has shaped me, it has had me behaving in a certain way in this world. And if I don't understand that, then I'm going to spend a lot of energy denying it. I'm going to be saying, no, it's not me. And I'm going to be doing all of these things to show that I'm not that, right? Instead of embracing it and then actually addressing what it's done to me and changing. And willingness to look first at myself when feelings of mad, sad, or scared surface. When this happens, ask first what is going on with me, looking within first. So why, when I'm feeling uncomfortable, to ask, or when I'm feeling, these emotions coming forward within me, rather than looking at the person and saying, and being mad at them for having me feel this way, to ask first, so what is it about me that has me reacting in this way? And those are often indicators of what you need to work on. So being mindful of your own emotions, your own feelings, your own reactions to what's being said are indicators of what you need to work on. So it becomes really profound. And then the other ones that I have are willingness to remain humble. This is really connected to our cultural safety work, the journey of humility, cultural humility. It's the approach. It's recognizing that we won't know everything that we need to know, that we're on this journey of being a learner. And I really believe that vulnerability is an act of humility. So it's a sign of strength. Being humble is actually a sign of strength. It's because you're aware of what's going on around you. And then willingness to recognize and own my places of privilege. So I have to acknowledge them, and I have to own them and know that they're there, again, because how could they not be? And work from a place of empowerment and vulnerability rather than guilt or shame. And I talked about that earlier too, about strategizing. You know, it's once you kind of understand these things you've done some work on it, and you recognize other patterns around you, then you can work with others and strategize to figure out, so what are you going to do when a student says that, in the room? You can think about it beforehand, and then maybe have a male ally in the room that is listening for male reaction, right? And then they can get up and address it, so that women don't have to address these things. And then the last one that I have listed here is willingness to hear anger and rage and without taking it personally. That's so important because there's so much need to be angry and to be full of, to be full of rage of what's going on, what women have to deal with. We should be willing as men to know that there is good reason for anger and rage and all of this, to not take it personally. Although there are times when we do need to be called into accountability, and that can be a reason for somebody to be angry at us. So it's really important to not shy away from anger and rage. So I think, how am I doing with slides? I just wanted to say really quickly about this slide. I took this from a blog by Karen Lincoln Michelle, who was talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how in a presentation by Cindy Blackstock, how she exposed and talked about how he was influenced by the Blackfeet people in Alberta, and actually kind of took his understanding and put it into a framework that's Blackfoot, but also he changed some things around from an Indigenous understanding. And so he talked about how at the base of this pyramid is your needs as a human being, to be fed, to be clothed, that kind of thing, to be warm. And the Indigenous way of thinking about things is actually your self-actualization, knowing yourself, knowing how you're connected to the world around you is actually at the base of an Indigenous world view. And then understanding how you're connected to the community, and then how your culture perpetuates this way of being. But what I wanted to focus on too is at the very top, and it's probably not so clear on the slide, but the very tip of the pyramid is transcendence. And on the Indigenous side, they talked about how that symbol was like a teepee. Right, and there's so many profound things that you can learn from the archetype of the teepee, and one of them is about the teepee helped us to remember that what happens on Earth, so the bottom part of the bottom triangle of the teepee, also happens in the world around you. So that when the poles come together and then they extend into the universe, it's recognizing that we're trying to mimic the patterns of the universe around us. And for my culture, actually the rope that you tie the poles together is called sapa, which is the same name that we use for the Black Hills in South Dakota, which was our most sacred place, where we performed ceremonies that had correlation to the constellations. So it's important to remember that connection to the world around you. And so Maslow calls that transcendence. And what I wanted to say about that I think that's an important aspect of all of this. Because in order to do this work of undoing our privileges and undoing racism and sexism, we have to have a transcendent understanding, I believe. We have to be able to see the big picture. And so another way of saying transcendence is about working from an analysis of systemic oppression or systemic sexism and racism. So I think I'll just say that much now, and perhaps there's some questions that could come forward that would highlight some of these points that I have up on the screen.
So I think given our time, we only have probably time for one comment or question. So I've got a comment here, and I think it kind of speaks to the struggle of some of this work. So as a white male, beginning my awareness of my individual experience and the systemic aspect of how I am, I feel quite frozen in taking any specific actions beyond reflection at this point. I feel quite lost when I dedicate some reflection on this. It is difficult work.
Yeah, just to say that you can get to a place that we call paralysis of analysis, right? Where you feel frozen because you start to see this. But that's a good place to be, because then you can start accessing vulnerability. I mean, this gentleman's comment is an act of vulnerability. He's talking about how he feels frozen. And that's an okay and, in fact, an essential place to be. So what's important for this gentleman and for people like me is to connect with other men who are also on this journey, and to begin to listen to women and to hear women in a different way that can actually provide a way forward, and to do it in such a way that you're not a burden on women. That's really important in all of this. So learning how to listen in a different way through the lenses of systemic sexism becomes a really important way. You start to hear things differently and can actually provide a way forward, both for the individual and as men who are starting to collect together and starting to talk about, so how can we as men, working for Island Health or what have you, how can we start to address the pervasiveness of sexism within an organization like Island Health or what have you, UBC. I don't know of any organization that doesn't have these issues.
So just having that question, where do we see male privilege in our organizations, and what can we do about it? Having those conversations, even though they're difficult. And I want to thank you, Harley, for coming and sharing what you have today. And I see a really strong, grounded, centered man who is modeling what it means to be authentic and vulnerable, and that we need to do this structurally and look at those systems of oppression, both racism, colonization, sexism. Look at those things structurally, but also at the individual level, creating space for people to heal, to be vulnerable, to feel their feelings, for men to be able to feel their feelings. And as we create that healing and that space for our men, we also create that space and that healing for our women. So I really was grateful for the conversation today. Also made me think about Mother Earth and acknowledging her on International Women's Day. And so I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today here at UBC, and also all that have joined on the webinar. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. I appreciate your comments that you posted here, and I'll relay some of those to Harley as well. And so also want to thank our team for getting the session set up, and we welcome any feedback and ideas folks have for our learning circles. So again, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you everyone on the webinar.